The Big Decision 2022. Live on Raw 12:51 a.m.
Hello, it's Wednesday evening here during Spring Elections Week. You are watching the third of Raw's interviews with all of the full-time officer candidates in collaboration with the Boar. And tonight, we are sitting down with your presidential candidates. Indeed, the tip top of the Students' Union tonight. We'll be sitting down with two of your presidential candidates, talking about their campaigns and talking about the interviews that they have with us tonight. Of course, all 7 full-time officers are important, but the president really is at the top of the SU, and it's really an opportunity tonight to cover all bases tonight. Pretty much every policy comes under the remit of the president, and this is certainly a very important interview tonight. Well, plenty, of course, coming as part of our coverage here of the spring elections on Raw this week. You've so far heard our interviews with the Education, Democracy and Development officers on Monday, the postgraduate and welfare officer candidates yesterday. We'll be talking to the sports and societies officer candidates tomorrow. All of these interviews you can find across our social media, our YouTube channel as well. And of course, on Friday night at 8 p.m, we will be announcing the results of the spring elections this year. So make sure you're tuning in for that. Again, across our social media, on our YouTube channel, and on the big screen in the Piazza as well. So plenty to be enjoying there. Well, before we get to talking to the presidential candidates, let's bring in, as ever, my trusty friends over at the Boar, Ellie MacArthur and Eden Full-Bailey, the news editors. Fantastic to have you join me again. Eden, let's come to you first. Of course, we've got a lot going on at Raw this week, but plenty still going on over at the Boar.
Yes, so currently we are writing up the interviews that we are so successfully talking about. And we are also interviewing students on campus and at voting booths to see what their opinions are on this election. And obviously it's a post-COVID election where we are seeing sort of more of an engagement, perhaps more people on campus who are ready to sort of voice their opinions on what they want to see on candidates' manifestos and their campaigns. So it's a very exciting week for sure.
Indeed. And of course, the excitement doesn't end here tonight. Of course, as it's Wednesday evening, if you're going circling tonight, you'll probably be joined by many of your spring election candidates. So I don't know if the tradition was always to go to circle, play a few drinking games, make yourself look like a complete idiot, all in the end to get some votes. I mean, I don't know if I would trust myself to make my SU voting decisions at Pop, but there we go. Warwick traditions, good to see them back as ever. And of course, Ellie, we're coming now into what really is crunch time in this week's elections.
Yeah, so we're halfway through the week and students have had a chance to meet the candidates and form their opinions on them. So now it's time for candidates to turn those undecided voters to votes.
Indeed, this really is the important time to do that now. And of course, speaking of being potentially one of those undecided voters, if you are an undecided voter or you just haven't voted yet, you may be sat here wondering right now going, how do I cast my vote this week? How can I cast my vote for the president, for all of the other full-time and part-time officers as well? How can I make my mark on the future of Warwick Students' Union? Well, let's be assured, this question will be answered for you now by X1.
Polls are opening soon. This video covers how voting works in SU elections and making your vote count. First, go to the Warwick SU website and log in using your student ID. Hover over the Student Voice tab and select the Elections option. Scroll down to the Spring Election section, and when polls open, click Vote Now. Voting uses the Single Transferable Vote System, or STV. When voting, you rank your favourite candidate as 1, but also rank the other candidates, so that if your first choice candidate isn't selected, your vote can be transferred to your second, third, and so on. And that's how to vote. Voting booths will also be available at the Social Sciences Quad, the Chemistry Department, WMG, WBS, the Piazza, the Oculus, the Sports Hub and Medical School as an additional place to cast your vote.
Thanks to X1 there for taking us through how you can vote in this year's spring elections. The all-important link that you need there, www.warwicksu.com/student-voice/elections, where you can vote for your full-time and part-time officer candidates, as well as, of course, take a look at their manifestos and get to know a little bit more about democracy here in the SU. Well, Ellie and Eden are still joining me, and let's move on now to the presidential interviews themselves. Now, as ever, we offered all candidates the opportunity to have an interview with us today. We have got interview offers accepted by two candidates, Sophie Kitching and Will Brewer. We'll be talking to them, of course. They are standing in this election alongside Jake Clifton and Nathan Parsons as well. But we've got a bit more time with the presidents, as it is just the presidents today, to sit and talk a little bit more about each of their interviews and many of the things that are brought up in it. So, without any further ado, I guess before we get onto that, let's talk a little bit more about the role of president and why it's so important. Ellie, I'll come to you first this time. Of course, as I said earlier, the president sits very much at the top of the SU. Their remit in many ways knows no limits. Just really encapsulate just how important that is for the student experience here at Warwick.
Yeah, well, I guess their mission and their campaign is what informs a lot of the policies of the other SU officers when the president actually comes into their position. So I guess their influence over all of the other candidates is probably one of the most important things.
Indeed. And of course, it's not just that the president has a lot of drive in policy as well, but in terms of the SAB team as well, the president is probably the most public face of all the SABs, the one that you meet during Freshers Week, the one that you certainly see first off and certainly maybe sets the tone for the rest of the team. And Eden, of course, having been the most recent fresher, perhaps, out of all of us. What's it like, I guess, for new students coming in and they see the SU president for the first time? They get their first experience of what the SU could be. Just really how important a position is that?
I think the president needs to be completely and utterly always present on campus, in our emails, on the Piazza big screen, much to their demise. But I feel like but I do agree, like, last year, because nothing was really in person, we didn't have this much of an engagement with the SU. And I think what freshers are looking for this year, or second years perhaps, they want someone who they can relate to. They want someone who is going to answer the pressing questions about the issues that we face at Warwick. And I feel that the best candidate to do so will be the one who unfortunately shouts the loudest.
Well, it may not necessarily be the case of whoever shouts the loudest. Of course, it is the policies as well that really do matter in this election. And of course, we said many presidents in the past have made a lot of promises, many of which have been delivered for candidates in the past. Most recently, we think of things like circuit laundry, lecture-free welcome week, the ending of the replacement for ID cards. So a lot of the policies that presidents have made in the past have been carried forward. It's a position with a lot of consequences. It's a position that a lot of students look to as well. The SU president, as we said, is probably the most known figure within the SU as well. So this is a very crucial set of interviews today, for sure. Well, as we said, the four candidates standing in this election, Jake Clifton, Nathan Parsons, Sophie Kitching, and Will Brewer. We will be doing interviews today with two of them that got back and accepted our offer. Sophie Kitching and Will Brewer will be going in alphabetical order. So firstly, to talk to Sophie Kitching from Raw, Enoch Bukungu.
Hello, welcome back. You are watching Raw 12:51 AM's continuing coverage of Big Decision 2022. I'm Enoch Bukungu, and I'm here interviewing presidential candidate Sophie Kitching. Sophie, welcome to the stream.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yes, Sophie, can you just give us a brief description, sort of a brief rundown?
I'm Sophie. My pronouns are she or they. I'm currently Disabled Students Officer. I'm also president and founder of the Society Autism at Warwick, and I'm running for president this year.
Okay, wonderful. What are your key priorities?
So I'd say I kind of have 4 kind of key themes which I want to focus on. So I'm interested in kind of better wellbeing and general health support for students, building strong and liberated communities, so things like improving inclusivity, diversity, accessibility, and also a focus on getting the basics right, so things like transport, parking, facilities. And then finally making sure that the Students' Union itself is kind of there and actually working for the students it's supposed to serve. So kind of all of that is more detail in my manifesto, but in kind of specific commitments. For example, I want to continue some of the things I've been doing as Disabled Students Officer this year. So things like pushing for universal lecture capture, accessibility standards that are enforced across departments to kind of end this situation where what you get is very dependent on what department you're in, what staff you're in contact with. And also kind of a wider set of plans. So, for example, improving the ways students get to and around campus, continuing work that's being done on getting access to free period products in all toilets, and making sure we keep access to self-certifications beyond the pandemic as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've touched on a bit there, but I'll ask another question, give you a little bit more time.
Mm-hmm.
What is the biggest issue facing Warwick students right now, and how do you plan to tackle it?
Yeah, so kind of building on a bit of what I said there, I think similar to a lot of universities at the moment, we're very much in the midst of a student mental health crisis. And while obviously there have been improvements in services at Warwick and more generally over the last few years, there's still so much more that needs to be done, you know, especially as we're kind of hopefully emerging from the pandemic. There's a lot of students who, you know, they've spent the last 2 years mostly in their rooms. They haven't had that much face-to-face teaching. And a lot of people just haven't even really met anyone yet. So kind of there's that sense of loneliness, and I think putting in the right kind of mental health support is going to be really vital going forwards. So in terms of what needs to happen, I think specifically, obviously, one thing is pushing the university for greater funding for support services to kind of cut those waiting lists down and get students, particularly those kind of waiting for counselling, to get them to get in front of someone a lot faster after that initial contact. And also making sure that support genuinely is available and accessible to everyone. So that would involve looking at things like hiring staff and counsellors from a much wider range of backgrounds and allowing students to have a bit more of a choice of certain things that might be helpful or unhelpful to them in the person that they're kind of having contact with. And obviously there's a lot of other specific things I think should be happening. So for example, I really want to see better training for all student-facing staff. But it's also not just about funding. And I think there's a lot to be done that isn't just about kind of intervention at that point where there's already problems, you know, but kind of things that actually is more about prevention. And I don't mean the, you know, things that you kind of see where you give people a workshop or a colouring sheet. I think it's kind of really important to start thinking on a much broader scale. So kind of, I would argue that the whole environment of higher education is kind of designed in a way that limits our ability as students to kind of experience well-being and restricts us from being able to make those choices that we're told we should, like, you know, take self-care, make sure you sleep well. Well, actually, that's not really an option in the way that higher education is structured. And it's laughable, really, that people kind of expect us to choose to disconnect from that kind of competitive, high-stakes, stressful, commercialized environment. So I think it's about the funding and the specific changes, but it's also about pushing for that kind of wider, more structural change as well.
Yeah, I mean, I want to stay on that same sort of topic, but move to a sort of a different area. When you'll be president of the Warwick SU, what will you do to create a more inclusive and accessible students' union, and especially for students from marginalized groups and low-income backgrounds?
Yeah, so I think one really key thing to do is kind of lower that financial burden of engagement. So I'd be looking to decrease the cost for sports and society federation membership to make sure that everyone can get involved without that being there as kind of a barrier. Or at the very least, kind of establishing some kind of funding that's there to help students who may be kind of struggling to afford that, so that that is society, sports, all of that is accessible to everyone from a financial side. I think also better training for SU staff. So kind of a much more comprehensive compulsory package of inclusivity, diversity and accessibility training to make sure that they're really serving kind of students' needs in the way they should be. And I think also from my experience as a part-time Disabled Students Officer this year, I think there could be a lot more done to improve that integration between those that are there in a full-time role and those that are there kind of part-time. So I'd be really looking to work a lot more closely with liberation officers, both to kind of help with their campaigns and provide anything I can to help them, but also getting their input on things that I'm working on and making sure that kind of everything that I do and that the SU does is very much considering kind of a diverse group of students.
Yeah, I mean, you discussed getting feedback from students. I mean, one of the big things we've seen this year has been a decline in engagement with the SU. Mm-hmm. How, as president, would you improve this sort of lack of student engagement. In both them, it's democratic structures, like in all student vote, but also in societies and sports clubs.
Mm-hmm. So starting with the kind of societies and sports clubs angle, I think obviously the decreased costs, as I've mentioned, would be really beneficial. And I think also that there will hopefully be some inevitable pickup in engagement as we start to emerge properly from the pandemic. However, I think there's also really important, like, specific things that need to be done. So, for example, I'd look at doing things like highlighting one society per week across SU social media channels to kind of increase awareness of that massive range of options that is out there. And the other thing that I found is that having not joined too many societies in my first year, I was quite nervous about getting involved with, new things, especially starting midway through a year. I didn't really know anyone. And I think doing something that's creating kind of online platform where society and sports club members can register as kind of like willing buddies for potential new members who want to join at any point in the year. So obviously I know a lot of societies do this internally, but having that central place where you can look and you say, well, here's a list of societies that's all got people that will be willing to kind of take me along with them to a session, or kind of just be that point of contact and introduction. And it's just a lot more obvious than just having to, message societies or check out their individual pages. And then in terms of kind of democratic engagement on that other angle, I think a big part of the issue that we're seeing there is definitely kind of a sense of disillusionment with the SU and kind of what it does, and whether it's really about, working for students, representing student voices, or whether it's maybe more of it. I've heard people say things like it's about, infighting, it's all about politics, they're not really doing anything for me. So I think a big part of re-engaging students will be about re-establishing a sense of trust and kind of a more kind of practical work to show that actually we are there, we're listening, we're doing something worthwhile. I think also something that I'm a big believer in transparency and kind of people knowing what you're doing and why you're doing it. So as disabled students officer, for example, I've made sure to regularly use social media, created a new Instagram account to keep people up to date. I've done blogs about what I've been doing. And I think that kind of aspect of, well, here's exactly what I'm doing for you, and you can see it and it's easily accessible and you don't have to go digging through pages of minutes from this meeting, that meeting. I think that kind of will hopefully allow students to be more engaged, rather than everything just kind of being that kind of mystery that's gone on behind closed doors and you don't really know there's these people, but what are they doing? Are they just there kind of arguing the entire time? So concrete action for students and actually telling people what it is we're doing and why we're doing it.
Yeah, of course, as president, your job is to go behind the closed doors, so the ultimate closed doors university, to talk to Vice Chancellor Stuart Croft and be sort of the students' voice to Stuart Croft. How do you see, under your presidency, the SU's relationship with the university?
I mean, I think that's quite a complex question in many ways. So I think we should aim for something that is collaborative, because the idea is that hopefully, in ideal circumstances, we are there working together, kind of improving students' experiences at Warwick. And I think there is a lot of stuff that can be achieved through, engaging in those processes, going to the meetings and so on. And often that can be more effective than framing everything as, this big battle where you're immediately establishing the university as kind of in opposition to the students. So going in hoping for that kind of collaborative work. But as I'm sure kind of all of us know, there are times and things on which Warwick's commitments are basically inadequate, and processes are so slow that when you've got an urgent issue and it needs urgent action, it's entirely useless. Or things where they're just, to be entirely blunt, they're just refusing to listen to students' concerns and needs. And I would say in that case, it's about the SU being there to stand up for students, to be a strong voice, to go against the university, to publicly disagree where we need to, and just kind of being there as that advocate, kind of as an independent body. So I suppose at the end of the day, it's like we are there for students. So it's having that flexible relationship that's like, yes, we're going to work together and have those meetings and have those discussions and where that's the most helpful thing, but also acknowledging that actually there comes a point where that's not helpful, and then that is where you kind of need to be there and stand up in the way that best enables us to advocate for students.
Yeah. I mean, looking past just the university, obviously students have far wider concerns than that. What will you do to advocate students' interests off campus as well as on campus?
Yeah, So I think it's really important to kind of go about engaging with local communities. So, for example, in Leamington and Coventry, building positive relationships with residents, and also thinking about kind of securing opportunities for students living off campus, and things like, you know, meeting with businesses in the local area, particularly those that might be popular with students. So clubs, for example, but also more generally, and talking about kind of the improvements that they could be making to better serve the student population. I'd also be really interested in looking into any possible collaborations with Coventry SU, and whether, you know, bringing those two massive bodies of students together, whether there's kind of change and interesting dialogue and conversations that could be happening there. But I think also just generally being a strong voice for students on issues that impact us, making sure, for example, student voice and opinion is heard in local media, or when decisions are being made that will affect us, make sure that all relevant stakeholders are hearing from us. And things like even issues that aren't traditionally considered to be student issues. I think it's really important that there's someone there who's actually kind of, again, standing up for students, telling them what we need. So, for example, things like the energy bill increase that's happening at the moment, that's going to have a massive impact on a lot of students. And I think a lot of the time in that kind of policy or decisions, both kind of at a national level and more locally, students very often are completely left out of the conversation. I think it's really important, and I would like to be a person that's there kind of with that voice, putting our view forward and making sure we're listened to.
Yeah, and one of the biggest issues currently affecting students is obviously transport. You'll several through the Stagecoach buses this term. How will you seek to improve transport options for students both around and on and off campus?
So as you say, the buses at the moment is the obvious thing to be talking about here. It's an absolute nightmare. We've all been there. You're just standing for goodness knows how long on the bus. Maybe it shows up, maybe it doesn't, maybe it drives straight past, who knows? I mean, it's absolutely infuriating. So I think really working on that. I mean, hopefully that will be fixed by that next year, but, you know, who knows? And I feel like possibly not. And it's really important that there is something being done on that. So I think it's things like, you know, making sure there are more frequent and reliable buses, making sure there's extra capacity at those peak times, like, you know, going in for your 9 a.m, make sure that's there, coming back in the evening, afternoons, coming back from pop. And also, as I said, kind of running buses later into the night. So I think all of that is conversations to be having with Stagecoach, with National Express. Because I think also this is kind of linking into a little bit of a wider conversation where, you know, we're getting told, oh, make sure you use public transport to get to campus. And actually, when it's like this, it's just not actually possible. So it's there in the situation where we're being penalised with like really high parking costs or fines or whatever. And actually, the alternative isn't there. So I think encouraging, you know, public transport, green transport, but make sure it works for students. And it's not just there as because, well, nobody can afford to park, so we have to use the buses, but the buses are also terrible. There has to be that proper, reliable, functional option.
Yeah. Let's talk about an issue right now that's absolutely a huge one, not just for students, of course, across the country. What more do you believe needs to be done to combat sexual assault on campus? And what extra support should be applied to victims? Obviously, many of these assault cases we hear happen within Warwick SU in just Warwick venues. What more needs to be done?
I think obviously we're looking at things like proper, more severe penalties for perpetrators, you know, taking that zero tolerance policy. And generally, there's a lot of improvements that need to be made to the university's processes for, you know, investigating and dealing with cases when victims do come forwards. I think also that there should be a lot more specialist support available for victims. So obviously that is available externally, but often, as with anything, waiting lists are ridiculous. So I think the university kind of has this responsibility to be aiming to provide things like trauma-focused therapy available to those who want it, with staff who are properly trained to engage with those issues and available kind of on an ongoing basis without a waiting list. I think also better knowledge and understanding for all victims. Obviously, the majority of victims are women, but also thinking that we want our approach and the services to be genuinely accessible and welcoming to everyone who needs them, for example, including men who might be victims of sexual assault as well. And I think I would also really be looking to kind of work with relevant student groups. That there's been a lot of amazing work that's been done on this issue already, and I'd really like to be working with them to kind of make sure that I'm highlighting the right issues and using my position to help them with kind of the work they're doing as well.
Yeah, I want to talk about one particular sort of facet of this whole issue, drink spiking. Also, we've seen a huge increase in drink spike incidents. There's been stories of injection spiking as well. And Warwick SU last term released a new drink spiking comment plan, although not all elements have yet been implemented. How will you deal with these increased incidents of spiking?
Well, I think obviously what's really important is that action needs to happen now. It's not something that can wait and say 6 months down the line we do something. So I think the sense of urgency is really needed. I'd be interested in looking into things like providing drink testing kits, drink covers and so on, as well as a kind of wider information campaign on how to, tell if your drink has been spiked. But I think really that although all of that is really important, the effort is kind of definitely needing to be focused on those who are doing the spiking, because obviously that is where the problem is. And I think tackling that, but also kind of the wider problem this is part of, which is a conversation around topics like consent, respect, misogyny, and so on.
Yeah. Okay. Then finally, one final question. Thanks so much for joining us here today. What makes you stand out from the other presidential candidates?
Yeah. So I think it's very easy to kind of make it about personalities, or I did this or I did that, or I'm this, I'm that. But what I really want to be here standing on is my manifesto and kind of the commitments that I'm making and the changes that I want to see. So what I would say, kind of, if you're a bit unsure, is definitely go and look at my manifesto, see kind of the things I want to do and kind of make the decision based off that. And I'm obviously always very happy to hear from anyone who has any questions or wants to discuss anything with me as well.
Okay, thank you so much, Sophie, for joining us. This is the end of this interview, but there are so many of Raw and the Boar willing to give massive amounts of coverage this week. So you want to get informed about what big decision is and how to take part, and who to give your vote towards. Please, there's so much other coverage out there. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
The Big Decision 2022 live on Raw 12:51 a.m.
And that was Sophie Kitching there, one of your SU presidential candidates this year, talking to Enoch Bakungu. Well, Ellie and Eden are still with me. Let's talk a little bit more about that interview now. Sophie brought up 4 key themes throughout. One point being improving well-being here on campus. Another point focusing on liberated communities and really cultivating and continuing a lot of the work that's been done with liberation communities on campus in the last couple of years. Another real emphasis from Sophie on what she described as basics, things like transport, parking, making these fairer for students. And then finally, as a general kind of note, really emphasizing an SU that's fair and working for students, bringing up things like universal lecture capture, self-certification, for example. Eden, perhaps if I can come to you on this. Certainly, Sophie has brought up there, certainly looking through that interview, perhaps a lot of themes and a lot of discussions, certainly, that we've been covering recently within the last few weeks here at Raw and in the Boar as well. Do you think the 4 key themes could resonate with students?
I certainly think so. I feel that the accessibility issue on campus in terms of universal lecture capture is definitely a topical one, especially as we move past the all-student vote last term. I feel like there's definitely sort of a vibe on campus that people are looking for answers about why their lectures perhaps are being pre-recorded last year, or how they're going to be able to watch more of their lectures without being on campus. I also think it's certainly a very topical issue that Sophie has mentioned is the transport issue, and I think recently we've seen there's a lot of complaints by students about the inconvenience of Stagecoach and sort of the emerging monopoly that we'll see in the next coming months. And I feel like she's definitely hit the nail on the head with that one.
Indeed, and perhaps, Ellie, if I can come to you now. Student mental health, when Sophie was talking about really the key point, and of course Sophie said really to look at a manifesto throughout for all of her policies, but student mental health, she said that's the biggest issue on campus at the moment, and it's been an issue that we've been talking about for years, not just really as a result of the COVID pandemic, but even before COVID as well. And it's interesting that amongst, of course, there's so many issues that Sophie could have picked out as her big issue, but student mental health really is her big issue. Why do you think that might be the case?
I think Sophie speaks a lot in her manifesto about accessibility. So I think really it comes down to that. So making sure that mental health provisions on campus are accessible. It is easy to get an appointment. There's not long waiting times. In terms of why mental health is such a prominent issue on campus, I guess it's a lot of stress going through the pandemic and trying to complete a degree. There's a lot of burnout amongst students, which we've seen a lot over the last year and a half. So I think likely burnout, stress, anxiety is quite high on the reasons for poor student mental health currently.
Indeed, and of course, this has been a crisis we've been saying it's been going on for years now, but particularly accentuated by the pandemic as well. Be interesting to see, of course, how this develops. Of course, not just obviously with the SU, but of course with the university as well, who are of course in charge of the wellbeing services here. Well, we've heard there from Sophie Kitching. As we said, 2 candidates got back to us for an interview. We're now going to bring you the second of the 4 candidates. Will Brewer now sat down with Raw Station Manager Rindacheva. Here is Will's interview.
Hello and welcome to Raw 12:51 a.m.'s coverage of the Warwick SU Spring Elections. My name is Rindacheva. I'm station manager at Raw, and today I'll be speaking to Will Brewer, who is running for the role of president of the SU. Hi, Will. How are you?
Hi, I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for being here today. So let's kick it right off. What are your key priorities as president?
So my key priorities are a more visible, approachable and personable report and support and wellbeing team. I think all too often we're a bit stuck in the past with Warwick, and it's a really big problem that we have with people not feeling like they can go to report and support and wellbeing, when in fact there's actually been a massive review, and working on the inside of it this year, I've seen how much work they do and how much effort the team puts in. And what's really important now is that we do encourage people to engage with them so that the university can actually take action against students that deserve it. And realistically, what we need to work on is building up that trust with students and the university again. I've already got a few things planned on those topics. In particularly, I'm planning a large-scale sort of town hall event that would be streamed to all students, and there would be a panel of a variety of different departments, including the SU commercial team, report and support, wellbeing, residential life team, community safety, everyone that's involved in student wellbeing, so that people get to see the actual people that they would be dealing with, the people that they would be seeing on the call when they meet them, and they get, a bit more personality to the people that would be dealing with their cases. I think it's also really important that we have a lot more welfare training for university staff, in particular personal tutors. A lot of them don't actually know the correct signposting for different issues. I think that's really important, that they really do know that absolutely 100% without any issues. It's also important that we promote report and support and everyone knows about it. One thing that I'm massively behind is that there should be a huge A3 report and support poster in every single first year flat, without a doubt, so that they see it, it's in their kitchen, they know about it immediately on arrival, and it's not something that we have to teach them about. And then finally, I've done a lot of work this year around tackling lad culture, sexism and discrimination. In particular, I'm part of the Healthy Masculinities project team with report and support and the Community Values Education Programme. And I've actually secured £6,500 worth of funding for that programme. And it will be a peer-led programme to tackle all of those issues and really tackle them at the heart. And it comes off the back of the Sexism in Sport Review, which I've been leading and chairing, which has acted as a research piece for that. Some of my other key priorities around education is really student-led decisions, in particular on in-person teaching, but taking into account that everyone is different, has different needs, there's different department needs and student needs. I come from a background of being an M.More student, which meant that my degree was split across 4 different departments, so I'm very aware of how different it can all be. I really think that we need to have an education strategy that is designed for students and not profits. it needs to be completely student-led. And we need to really look at what the different needs of our different student types are. And it might be that some courses are going to have to cater to those multiple needs. In particular, I think that there's a lot more engagement that needs to go with part-time PGR, PGT students and distant learners, because their needs are wildly different to the typical undergraduate student that the SU is known to represent. Self-certification still isn't across the university. There are still some departments like engineering that don't have self-certification, which is ridiculous, and it's just not fair. Also, being different departments, I'm aware that swapping seminars is becoming more and more difficult, and especially they don't allow you to swap seminars for extracurricular commitments, and that should be a thing. And something that I'm quite keen on is there's a new personal relationship policy between staff and students, and that needs to be a lot more clearly delivered to staff, and students need to be aware of it so that they know when it's being broken. I'm also very keen, going along the same lines, that we need more integrated role for part-time officers and liberation groups in the SU. They do a lot of really amazing work, and we need to bring it all together and really use the power of the SU with them to get their policies and the things that they really care about really being a part of the SU, and so that they also feel a part of the SU and people feel like the SU is for them and for everyone. And particularly, I think that the SU is something that's been very poor on, is telling students what they actually do and what they do well. We will always, that there will be times where we will be at fault, but there are some really great things we do and students need to know about that. So I want a more campus-wide and transparent SU with a really great marketing strategy. And then finally, back to my roots as a sports officer, but focusing more on the society side, we need proper support and a full training program for society execs. The sports program is really good. They get a lot of help and a lot of support, and it's something that we really need to work on with the society side, especially on the welfare training, and making sure that there's proper staff support for the society side. It's been really, there's been a few staff shortages this year, and it has really affected the support that they need. So looking at doing fast tracking some key work on staff retention and recruitment to make sure that they have the correct support that they need.
Thank you so much, Will. You mentioned a little bit about sexism and lad culture previously. Obviously, a huge deal this year has been increased instances of spiking. How are you planning to deal with that?
So on the spiking side of things, the SU commercial team has been working quite a lot on that, but I've been the lead full-time officer from the current sabbatical team dealing with the instances of spiking, and sort of not just here, but like across the nation. I've been in a lot of meetings with various different people about spiking already. In particular, police officials, some MPs and other SUs, the victims commissioner. So really trying to bring that all together. Some key work that I've done already is that I've started a good night out accreditation process with external venues. So we've done a lot of work internally, but what I've realized is that actually a lot of the problems are really in the external venues that our students go to. So I've already managed to get multiple venues in Leamington Spa and working on some of the venues in Coventry to sign up to this Good Night Out accreditation. I've secured the funding for us to actually pay it for them. And I'm working with MPs and local council to make sure that they reaccredit each year. And what that does is it trains all of their staff in how to deal with cases of sexual harassment, things to do with spiking, discrimination, all of it. It's a really inclusive training set. And they also work with the organisation to do policy support as well, to change their policies on how they work with things and deal with it. They come back every 3 months to do debriefs on any incidents that they've had and how they could have done it better or what they did well. And it's something that I really want to make sure continues, which is why I'm working with councils and MPs to make sure it's a requirement that they keep reaccrediting with the Good Night Out programme. Internally with the SU, we've had lots of meeting with key groups, so Protect Warwick Women, it happens here, Warwick Anti-Sexism Society. I've had multiple meetings with them, really, really productive. And a lot of it was to do with them not realizing what we already did. But also they've suggested some really great ideas, which we're starting to adopt. And I'm really pushing forward on the marketing inside the commercial areas around spiking, around who's there to help, around the fact that spiking someone with alcohol is still spiking, which I think a lot of people don't realize. And we've done work with social sex to make sure that there's always a social sex in the circle, so that they're always watching the drinks when everyone goes to the bar. So no, I've already done quite a lot of work on that. I'm very keen to continue working with the respective groups to make sure that we can really tackle all of the issues, but very connected as well to the national picture and seeing how it's going. And really, Warwick SU has responded quite well in comparison to some other SUs, but definitely still some things we can learn and definitely some more improvements that we can do.
Absolutely. How would you help to create a more inclusive and accessible SU? You've been speaking about that already, but especially for students from marginalized groups and lower income backgrounds.
So in terms of starting with the marginalized groups, I think it's really, really key that we build that connection with our part-time officers and our liberation groups. I don't think it's any big secret that the SU and those groups have struggled in the past to work together. And I think it's really important that the full-time officers really do work with the part-time officers and the liberation groups to really understand what they're looking for and what they want from an SU and what we need to change in order to make that happen. So it's what I would be looking to do is having sort of regular meetings with those part-time officers and the liberation groups when they can do them. I'm aware that they're all volunteers, unlike the full-time staff, so that we're going to have to work around them a bit more. If that means having meetings later on in the evening, things like that, that's completely fine. It's about finding that time where they can always make sure that their needs and what their priorities are heard by the SU and by the full-time officer team. And by no means as well should all of the onus be on them. There needs to be a lot more education as well. There needs to be a lot more sort of self-led education by the full-time officer team and by the SU staff to sort of see their point of view as well. And it is really building that connection. It's something that is a very key priority for me going forward next year, is to try and bring everyone together and have an SU that people do feel a part of, and it's not just a complaint service. In terms of widening participation and those sorts of students, I think that actually we need to sort of take a few hints from the university. So the university, actually, particular departments, have a lot of really good widening participation programs. And I think we need to link in with that a lot better. There's a lot more data sharing that I think is not going on there that needs to be happening. In particular, I've introduced a sports officer bursary scheme this year, which is targeted at widening participation students. But I'm the first person to admit we've promoted that in completely the wrong way. It should be getting promoted through departments to their students that they know are widening participation students. And it needs to go straight through the departments to them, to those people that would never even consider thinking about joining a sports club because they can't afford it. So no, there's definitely more work to be done in that area. And it is something I do care about quite a lot. You know, a lot of students have money troubles, but there are some that really do struggle. And the university do have those programs, and I think we just need to link that better in with the SU.
Amazing. And building on that, you know, as SU president, you would be the students' leading representative to the vice chancellor. What do you think the relationship between the SU and the university should look like?
So I think that it needs to be an honest relationship. I think that is key. And I think also there is a lot of work that can be done with the university first. I think that there's work to be done on respect. I think that there are times that it's been very apparent that the university sees us as a department, and I think we need to work on that a lot more. However, at the same time, I think we also need to, in some cases, not all, respect that the university do do want to work with us on some things and do want to try and make that happen. And working together, you can get so much more done. And that's what I've realized this year, that a lot of my policies and a lot of the things that I've done and that have happened have worked with collaboration. And I think it's really key to get that collaborative point with the university, but at the same time, be very willing to stand up for what you believe in and what students believe in. I've never been someone to mince my words. I've never been someone to stay silent in a committee meeting. Very odd for a sports officer. But it is really, we need to speak up, but we need to speak up in the right way. We need to really help them understand the points where we're coming from and why we don't agree with them always. And it is really that working together. Another point I really want to work with the university on is around, we often get consulted after the fact. And I really think that when they've got these projects and these ideas, sometimes they can actually be quite good, but they've started off in the wrong way. They need to start with student involvement. They need to start and come from the students, and then they need to operationally make it happen, rather than them thinking this will be good and then going, oh, do you think this is good? But I do think that we've done a lot of work as an officer team to get better relations with the university this year. I do think it's working, and we're moving forward there, and I think we need to carry on with that. But at the same time, make it very clear that we are a students' union, and it is our job to stand up for what students want, and that will not always align with the university, but we do still want to work with them on the things that do align.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're almost running out of time here, so I want to ask you one final question. What makes you stand out from the other presidential candidates?
So I don't know all of the other presidential candidates yet, given the recording, but in terms of what makes me stand out is that I'm a very active, engaged president. I'm someone that I work very operationally coming from sports. I'm someone that will do things and fix things. Okay, so every day, I'm not someone that wants to just sit on committees. That's a really big point for me. I don't want to just sit in university committees that are not always really that led or that relevant to students. It's a really big part of me running for president. Something that I've spoken a lot with before I ran was that I want to be an operational president. I want to be a president that's very visible. I want to be across campus. I want to be at as many academic inductions as I can be at to tell students about the Students' Union, tell them what they do, what they're about, get people engaged with the Students' Union, especially to do with voting, and really push that. So I'm going to be a president that's visible, that's doing things, that ticks off things on their manifesto and just uses it as a to-do list and just keeps going until it's done. And it's something that I've done with my sports officer manifesto, and I'm only halfway through and I've already almost completed it, and I've done loads of other things that I didn't even know were going to be things that existed yet. So I think what makes me stand out is that I'm a fix-it man. You give me a problem and I will fix it and I'll get it done, and I will keep doing that. And I think people have noticed that this year. So people come to me with problems, even if it's not massively related to my job, and I try and get things sorted or get them to the relevant person. And I think that will be the difference, is I'll be someone very visible and someone that has a lot of things to show for my achievements at the end of the year.
Thank you so much. Well, you've been absolutely brilliant. Good luck. And thank you so much for being here.
No, thank you very much, and appreciate the time you've taken.
The Big Decision 2022 live on Raw 12:51 AM.
And that there was Will Brewer sitting down with Rindacheva, of course, talking about his hopes and his manifesto. Oh, fuck, it will start again. Hold on. Hold on, sorry, I lost the English language. And that was Will Brewer there, speaking to Rindacheva about his manifesto and his plans should he be elected as your Students' Union president. Well, Ellie and Eden are still with me, and of course, a lot really brought up by Will in that interview there. There's two words that I think stick in my mind that I'm going to ask you about and ask you to build upon a bit more. Firstly, Ellie, visibility. Will made a big point throughout his interview about wanting to be not just a president who obviously has the title and goes to a lot of meetings, but a president who's visible to the students, someone who students feel they can approach and talk to about a lot of things, and talk to you about a lot of the big issues that we've seen on campus that really do require open dialogue and engagement. Issues like spiking, issues like sexism within sports clubs and societies, for example. A lot of issues that require a lot of open dialogue. And Will really making the point in his interview that he wants to be that visible candidate that really does fulfill that.
Yeah, definitely. I think he speaks a lot about being more personable and wanting students to know more about what the Students' Union is actually getting up to. I think really that comes down to just building up trust with students again. I know this year we've seen quite low turnout in things like the all-student vote, especially this term. It was a really small mandate. So I think being more personable and telling what the Students' Union are doing might actually increase engagement. So it's quite interesting.
Indeed, it's very interesting on that point with lower engagement this year, that visibility, if that is something that increases engagement, as you said, confidence as well in the union, it's something that will certainly have a lot of benefits going forward. Eden, visibility was one word Will brought up a lot. Accessibility is another word. And like Sophie, in many ways as well, Sophie made accessibility a big part of her interview for Will as well, really talking about particularly working with liberation societies, for example, working on things like cultures as well, in things like societies, sports clubs, and just throughout the union in general. Accessibility certainly seems to be a very key theme in this year's election.
I agree. Yeah, the fact that more than one candidate has brought up the issue of accessibility kind of sort of shows that perhaps there is actually sort of a deep ingrained problem within the SU about that. And I feel like it is definitely a pertinent issue. We've seen recent news about drink spiking. There's obviously been an entire review of the report and support system at Warwick. There's also been sort of a report and support boycott night of Pop and all these other clubs in Leamington. So I feel that that is an especially relevant issue that students will be looking towards in manifestos by president candidates. And I feel that it is going to be incredibly interesting to see what the candidates say about how they're going to improve accessibility at Warwick, because it's one thing mentioning it, but it's another thing implementing policies that definitely tackle the issue.
Indeed. It's a very important thing to say. Obviously, words are just words. Actions are, of course, actions, and really the reality of what happens. Well, before we get any more philosophical in this interview today, it's time, of course, to say we've spoken, of course, to the two presidential candidates now, Sophie and Will, who, of course, replied to interviews. As we said, there are 4 candidates in this race: Jake Clifton, Nathan Parsons, Sophie Kitching, and Will Brewer. Of course, you can vote for them until 7 p.m. on Friday evening using the link down at the bottom of the screen, warwicksu.com/student-voice/elections. Well, Ellie, Eden, once again, it's been fantastic to have you join me today. We've got one more go at this tomorrow evening. It's Sports and Societies tomorrow night, or as Ollie Barron and Charlotte Lloyd said last year when I spoke to them when they were Sox and sports officers, team fun tomorrow. So we can have a lot of fun tomorrow. Not that we've not been having fun already, because this has been certainly a very enjoyable week. But all I can say now, thank you so much for tuning into our coverage today. As ever, all of the hustings and all of the interviews that we're conducting this week, you can find on Raw's social media pages, on our YouTube channel as well. And of course, results night this Friday, 25th at 8 p.m. Make sure you're tuning in for that. It's going to be a fantastic evening. Well, thanks very much for tuning in, and we hope to see you again.
Across campus, online, and on 12:51 a.m. This is your student radio station.